Good day. Welcome to the first recorded lecture for Biology 102. These recorded lectures will be available to you for most chapters in the book. This is the lecture for the first week, which covers Chapter 1. These lectures are designed to use concurrently with the book. I don't want you to use these lectures as a substitution for reading the book. The lecture materials, to the best extent, follows the chapter, but I may depart from the chapter from time to time and discuss concepts in a slightly different way or with some local examples rather than exactly following the text in the book. Just a little point about listening to these recordings. I record the chapters in full, so I don't have that many meetings set up for you to review when we construct the playback table. Use the playback feature to play, stop, and pause the recording, or you can use the scroll button at the bottom of the screen to skip around in the presentation if you like. The presentations are rather long, but you can use these tools to break up the presentation into parts, or again to use the presentation in the way you choose to listen to these lectures. These are some short screenshots just to show you the playback tab at the top left of the screen that you're listening to, or you can use the scroll button at the bottom of the screen. This red-eyed tree frog is from Costa Rica and is one of the millions of beautiful and intriguing species that inhabit our planet and are essential to sustaining a habitable environment. Scientists are concerned in particular about declining populations of frogs worldwide, and frogs are considered an indicator species for the health of the world's ecosystems. Frogs seem to be declining even in relatively undisturbed intact ecosystems by humans. We're not sure why. Possible causes are habitat loss, additional ultraviolet radiation from the ozone hole, pervasive pollution where even subtle amounts affect frogs, worldwide movement of diseases such as saprolegnia and chytrids, which are both fungal organisms that affect frogs. This is an outline of the content in Chapter 1. I always think it's important to read the first chapter of a textbook because it sets the stage for what is to follow. This chapter then reviews these concepts. It's a global and social context in addition to the scientific aspects of environmental science. Rizal, China, is one of the 4 carbon-neutral cities in the world. China overall is the leading producer of wind turbines, photovoltaic panels, and solar water heaters, greater than other countries such as the U.S. China will have to look at alternative energy to keep up with the current pace of the growth of its economy and its energy needs that go along with that. But China is also a leader in using coal, a traditional fossil fuel. Some climate scientists warn that we cannot solve climate change unless the entire world stops building coal plants, including China. China's burning of coal creates air quality problems that they have yet to solve. China has an opportunity, although, to implement clean energy with its huge growth and demand for new housing, electricity, and technology. So this city is an example of one of the greenest cities on Earth, and you can see the solar panels on the rooftops here. China also has advantages that the U.S. doesn't have in its debate and implementation of renewable energy. China has low labor and raw materials costs. For example, cost for polysilicon, the ingredient in solar panels, is 1/10 the cost of the same material in the U.S. There are less restrictions on building plants, and the government can also mandate that utilities use renewable power if they choose to, with little resistance. The U.S. continues to debate our own energy future. These issues in this case study illustrate how complex the field of environmental science is. In biology, we focus on principles and concepts of life. Environmental science also includes biology, but it is a broader science. I think this is an important statement at the top of this slide. Humans inhabit both the natural world, but they also inhabit a built environment that includes an artificial constructed environment for our needs, and also includes a social world. Because of our achievements as a species, we now have the ability to manipulate the environment on a grand scale. We can extract resources, we can generate waste products, and we can affect our environment in ways that threaten both our own existence and that of the many organisms that share our planet. Climate change is the issue of our day. It's probably the one you've heard the most about. Unfortunately, it is just one of many environmental problems that we have. In order to improve things, we need to understand how the natural world works, the basis for all living things, but we also have to understand how we achieve improvements in our social world. So let's start with understanding what the term environment means. Environment has two aspects. One, conditions that surround an organism or groups of organisms, or a complex of social or cultural conditions that affect an individual or community. This diagram illustrates how interdisciplinary the environmental field is. The point that I would like to make about this chart is that the environmental field is not just for environmental science degrees or biology degrees. There are plenty of other opportunities in other majors where you can get involved in the environmental sciences. Your book opens with a statement that we live on a marvelous planet. This is really true. Life on our planet exists from the very top to the very bottom of our world. I've included some photos of some of my favorite creatures here just to illustrate this point. The snow leopard is a big cat related to tigers that lives at the top of the world, literally, above the tree line in the highest mountains of the Himalayas. Snow leopards depend on another species called the baral, or the Himalayan blue sheep, that you can see here, both in landscape view and close up, as their source of food. The baral are grazing animals that feed on grass or seasonal growth that occurs in the warm parts of the year in the high mountains. So the snow leopards feed on them to get their source of food. Both the snow leopard and the baral have adaptations and compete to survive in this harsh environment. Both are agile climbers and runners. The snow leopard is a skilled stalker, while the baral travels in herds and has clever escape strategies. Another example, not to forget the plants, is the noble rhubarb. It is a plant of the high Himalayan mountains too, in the same area. It is 1 to 2 feet tall and stands out in the vistas of these mountains. Looks kind of odd for a plant, you would think. The white structures are actually bracts that pass through visible light, creating a greenhouse effect inside the structure and warming the tender parts of the plant. at the same time blocking ultraviolet radiation. These are important adaptations and defenses against the harsh environment that has increased ultraviolet exposure and also extreme cold. These adaptations of both the plant and the snow leopard and the boreal were gradually acquired through the process of evolution. So let's continue on to the bottom of the world. The giant tube worm lives at the bottom of the oceans, next to these hot ocean vents called black smokers. These are volcanic vents in the center of the ocean plates where magma rises to the surface and builds the plates. These areas are rich in heat and chemical nutrients, but have absolutely no light. Half the weight of the tube worm comes from bacteria that it supports in its body. They have no digestive tracts. The bacteria turn oxygen, hydrogen sulfide, and carbon dioxide into organic molecules on which the host worms feed. This process, known as chemosynthesis, is a process similar to photosynthesis, which we'll discuss, but occurs in the absence of light. So let's move to the center of the planet and look at the pitcher plant. The pitcher plant is a carnivorous plant that occupies more moist tropical forests for the most part. The pitcher has attractants in it for insects, that once the insects get in there, they fall into the trap and they cannot get out. The interior of the plant is lined with a waxy surface so the various insects cannot crawl out. Once in the bottom, digestive compounds at the base in a liquid solution drown the insects, and the enzymes digest nutrients that the plant absorbs. Carnivorous plants are more common in tropical forests because of the warm temperatures and high rainfall. These forests produce a lot of plant biomass and a wide variety of species. But these types of systems are low in nutrients, so the species have to compete for nutrients. It's rather ingenious that this plant actually feeds on animal life to enhance its nutrition. Let's look at a drier environment, but in the middle of the world, the White's tree frog. This frog is native to Australia and New Zealand and is an example of one of the many species that inhabit the temperate zones of the planet. They are a nocturnal species, feeding mostly on insects and tree canopies, and they have sticky footpads that give them traction on tree branches. They also make popular pets. Next, your chapter goes into the current conditions. We face many serious problems. You may be aware that on October 31st, 2011, the 7 billionth human baby was born. The introduction to our current conditions lists some of the more pressing environmental problems that we have to solve. Chapter 1 gives a brief overview of these key problems, but we'll explore these various problems and their solutions in more detail as we go through the course. Let's start with climate change. Burning fossil fuels, making cement, and cultivating rice paddies, clearing forests, and other human activities release carbon dioxide and other so-called greenhouse gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. Scientists are alarmed and are pretty confident that over the past 200 years, the greenhouse gas concentrations have increased to the level that it's starting to affect our planet. Most scientists agree that the debate over whether climate change is occurring is over. We'll discuss the full dimensions of the climate change issue in Chapter 15. Food and hunger. Over the past century, global food production has more than kept pace with human population growth, and this is hopeful news. But there are worries about whether we will be able to maintain this pace, particularly as our biosphere declines and our populations increase. Soil scientists report that about 2/3 of all agricultural lands show signs of degradation. Biotechnology and intense farming techniques have had a lot to do with our gains, but are we outpacing the ability of our soils to produce the food that we need? The other issue is food sources are not always distributed equitably around the world. We will look at food issues in farming in chapters 9 and 10. Water. Some say that water will be the gold of the 21st century. A major concern of climate scientists and water planners is the effect of climate change on water supplies, particularly in the arid West, which California is a part of. Many people don't have adequate access to safe drinking water. So we have to be concerned about how these issues interact with each other. We will examine water availability and water use along with water pollution in chapters 17 and 18. Looking at energy, how we obtain and use energy is likely to play a crucial role in our environmental future. Fossil fuels are the energy of choice, and we provide about 80% of our energy needs using fossil fuels. As you know, fossil fuels contribute to climate change. The U.S. has been talking about an energy policy for decades, yet does not have one. Cleaner and renewable energy resources, such as those now being produced in China, and also here to some extent, have a variety of options, and together with conservation and maybe more limited use of fossil fuels may help us to go into our future with a cleaner energy strategy. We will look at both conventional energy and alternative energy in chapters 19 and 20. Biodiversity loss is another concern. Biologists report that habitat destruction, overexploitation, pollution, and introduction of exotic, that means introduced organisms, are eliminating species at a rate comparable to the great extinctions that marked the end of the age of dinosaurs. In fact, we refer to this, our current time, as the Holocene extinction event, named for the current epoch that we are in now. The UN Environment Program reports that over the past century, more than 800 species have disappeared, and at least 10,000 other species are considered threatened. This includes about half of all the primates and freshwater fish, together with around 10% of all plant species. Top predators, like the snow leopard, including all the big cats in the world, are particularly rare and endangered. One study estimates that all tigers will disappear from the wild by about 2020. Do you remember the March of the Penguins movie that was such a big hit a while ago? Well, about 50% of that population still remains. We will examine the basic life principles that govern how habitats support living organisms and the biodiversity issues. We'll cover these topics in chapters 3 through 6, and then also look at how to manage and improve biodiversity in chapters 11 and 12. Pollution is another concern. We'll cover that too. Although the industrial countries have made progress on air pollution, air quality has worsened dramatically in many areas over the world. Over southern Asia, for example, satellite images recently showed that a thick toxic haze of ash covered the entire Indian subcontinent for much of the year. There was just a recent article this morning on the news about an air pollution emergency of particulates in Beijing, and the residents are encouraged to stay inside. Mercury has also been found in all the lakes in the U.S., prompting the EPA to issue mercury emissions regulations in 2011. We'll discuss air pollution issues in Chapter 16. Many cities in Europe and North America are actually cleaner and more livable now. And clean technologies such as solar panels and wind turbines are now being produced. So all of these things will help. Looking at health, as our last point, the incidence of life-threatening infectious diseases has been reduced sharply in most countries during the past century, while life expectancies have nearly doubled. But in spite of this, we have a mixed bag. Some countries are facing food abundance to the point where it's affecting our health, and other countries are facing food scarcity and also chronic health problems. So Chapter 8 looks at these issues. There are also signs of progress that are occurring in these issues. We have an advantage in the rapid and worldwide sharing of information. There's a large amount of work being done by the NGOs, non-government organizations, and using government cooperation, we're starting to make progress on certain conservation issues with habitats. Renewable energies are becoming more viable than they used to be. Wind energy now rivals the cost of coal and gas in terms of comparing these costs. As the world becomes a smaller place, and as we understand the importance of the environment, international cooperation has increased. And so this book, and one of the things I like about it, it talks about some of these solution efforts that are being made. And this gives us reason for hope. Your chapter also goes into a little bit about the history of environmental sciences. And so I'll let you take a look at that and examine the 4 distinct stages. After a brief history, the chapter then goes to a look at some of the key environmental scientists that have led us to where we are today. They're listed here: Rachel Carson, David Brower, Barry Commoner, and Wangari Maathai, the late Wangari Maathai. So I'll talk a little bit about them. David Brower is the former executive of the Sierra Club. He introduced some of the techniques of environmentalism, including litigation and intervention in regulatory hearings and publicity campaigns. Barry Commoner was one of the first political scientists that spoke out about science and technology and politics, and he wrote a number of books. Rachel Louise Carson is one of the scientists that's credited for the beginning of the environmental movement. She was an American marine biologist and conservationist that worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And she wrote a book called Silent Spring that lamented the introduction of pesticides and their effect on native plant communities. Late in the 1950s, Rachel Carson turned her attention to conservation, and especially environmental problems that she believed were caused by synthetic pesticides. Her work is sort of credited with our national pesticide policy and the nationwide ban on DDT that happened in the 1970s. Wangari Maathai was a Kenyan environmental and political activist. She was educated in the United States and also in Kenya. She founded the Green Belt Movement, which was an environmental non-governmental organization focused on planting of trees, environmental conservation, and women's rights. She received international awards, and then she was elected a member of Parliament and served as the Assistant Minister for Environment and Natural Resources. She died of complications of cancer in 2011. I put together this slide to give you some other historical figures in environmental conservation that particularly speak to me. George Perkins Marsh published Man and Nature in 1864 and lamented excessive grazing and deforestation. Gifford Pinchot was the first professional forester and headed up the USDA Forest Service. Teddy Roosevelt, you'll probably remember from history. He established some of the first national parks. He was quite an outdoorsman. And he was inspired by George Perkins Marsh paper to make the policy changes that he made during his tenure as president. James Hansen heads the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia. He gave testimony to the U.S. Congress on climate change in 1988 and persisted in bringing the issue before the public and the government throughout the 1990s and also the 2000s. Jane Goodall was first noted for her work with wild chimps. She moved on to look into worldwide issues around conservation, and she is now a worldwide advocate for conservation and speaks at many venues. Her approach goes beyond just studying species. She's a major advocate for community and social solutions to save species that are endangered. Ian McHarg published the Design with Nature book. It was one of the early textbooks on urban and regional planning. It was a philosophy of identifying appropriate uses of land and advocating a more natural approach to setting up urban and residential landscapes. He also gave a seminal speech called Man, Planetary Disease in 1971, warning that mankind was over-consuming and affecting the environment. John Muir, who is probably familiar to many of you, was a naturalist. He was an early advocate of preservation of wilderness in the United States. His activism helped to preserve the Yosemite Valley, one of our local California parks, the Sequoia National Park, and other wilderness areas. He founded the Sierra Club. Aldo Leopold wrote the Sand County Almanac. He was an American author, scientist, ecologist, forester. He was also a professor at the University of Wisconsin. The County Almanac is read extensively still. He was influential in the development of modern environmental ethics and the movement for wilderness conservation. And just as an aside, two of his children were professors at Berkeley, California, which is a local connection. Starker Leopold was a professor of wildlife management, and Luna Leopold was a professor of hydrology. Both made significant contributions in these fields. So modern information technology now allows for increased international communications, and this has led to the emergence of some global leaders. We've already mentioned Wangari Maathai from Kenya. Yu Zhaogang is a Chinese environmentalist, also award-winning environmentalist. He's created groundbreaking watershed management programs while researching and documenting the socioeconomic impacts of dams on local Chinese communities. Mohammed Yunus is a Bangladeshi banker, economist, and Nobel Peace Prize recipient. He was a professor of economics, and he developed the concepts of microcredit and microfinance. These small loans are being used to enhance economic abilities in countries, but these also have conservation and land preservation benefits. Gro Brundtland from Norway is a Norwegian social democratic politician, physician, and an international leader in sustainable development and public health. She served on major world health bodies, including the World Health Organization. She's also served on a number of other commissions that are looking at sustainability and progress of sustainability. She narrowly escaped an assassination attempt on the famous Utoya Island, where 70 people were killed by a gunman a few years ago. We live in a divided world, and this book also provides some perspective on this. Many of the world's population and percentages of these populations and percentages of populations within wealthier countries live in poverty. As we will see as we explore the issues, poverty affects progress on environmental issues. The gap between rich and poor countries continues to increase. Despite a slow progression of decreasing poverty throughout the world, the gap between rich and poor in the U.S. continues to widen as well. In 2011, the gap was the greatest in 40 years. We will explore the quality of life further in this course. But think about this. Those of us in the richer nations now enjoy a level of affluence and comfort unprecedented in human history. But we consume an inordinate share of the world's resources and produce an unsustainable amount of pollution to support our lifestyle. What would happen if everyone in the world tried to live at the same level of consumption? What will the environmental effects be if other nations try to emulate our prosperity? We are seeing this in China and India and other parts of the developing world. In some cases, we have criticized these countries for aspiring to the same level of affluence and consumption that we have long enjoyed. Alternatively, what if we focused on the quality of life rather than on consumption. Over the past 50 years, the world's gross domestic product increased from 2 trillion to 22 trillion. So a huge amount of economic progress is being made by humankind as a whole. Since World War II, the average real income in developing countries has doubled, and the life expectancy has increased by 30%. But again, the worldwide gap between rich and poor has widened and is still widening. In 2004, a group of ecologists and economists had a conversation. The question was, how do we define quality of life, and do we skew this metric towards an unhealthy consumption? This conversation included Paul Ehrlich, another leader in the environment, author, professor at Stanford University, who has actually spoken on this campus as well. Other well-known economists were also included. Many ecologists view continual growth as impossible in the long run due to limits imposed by non-renewable resources and the capacity of the biosphere to absorb waste. Others argue that through the use of technology and social organization, we can manage to meet our needs and provide long-term but not infinite growth. I find this technology question interesting too, and this is something that we'll talk about that you may have gain perspective on as we go through this course. It is possible that a techno world might solve some of our problems. Have you heard of food towers, for example? This is a picture of one. I also like this idea promoted by your book. Indigenous people often lived in harmony with their environment, recognizing that their survival depended on it. So this book takes a look at this issue and also proposes the thought that preserving cultural diversity along with ecological diversity is an important part of environmental science. Cultural diversity and biodiversity often go hand in hand. 7 of the countries with the highest cultural diversity in the world are also on the list of megadiversity countries with the highest number of unique biological organisms. The list of countries here is listed in decreasing order of importance, so you can see where the graph overlaps here. This is also an example of a graphic technique called a Venn diagram, which shows all possible relations between 2 or more sets of data. Part of our divided world is that different countries, regions, and populations have different views. Worldviews are defined as sets of basic beliefs, images, and understandings that shape how we see the world around us. But different groups, even individuals, have different worldviews. The ways we interpret environmental issues, or our decisions about what we should or should not do with natural resources, depends partly on our basic worldviews. Perhaps you have a basic ethical assumption that you should be kind to your neighbors, or that you should try to contribute in positive ways to your community. Do you have similar responsibilities to take care of your environment, to conserve energy, to prevent the extinction of rare species? Why or why not? Your position on these questions is partly a matter of ethics or your sense of what is right and wrong. Some of these ideas you learn early in life, and some might change over time. Ethical views in society also change over time. One of the learning objectives of this course is for you to develop your own sense of environmental ethics. Over time, we have gradually extended our sense of moral value to a wider and wider circle, an idea that is known as moral extensionism. In most countries, women and minorities have basic civil rights. Children cannot be treated as poverty. Even domestic pets have some legal protections against cruel treatment. For many people, moral value also extends to domestic livestock, which makes eating meat a fundamentally wrong thing for them to do. For others, this moral extension ends with pets or with humans. Some people extend moral value to include forests, biodiversity, inanimate objects, or Earth as a whole. This chart in your book graphically presents the idea or the extension from the individual to wider and wider views of moral extensionism. Ethical and moral values are often rooted in religious traditions, which try to guide us in what is right and wrong. With growing public awareness of environmental problems, many religious organizations have begun to take stands on environmental issues as well. They recognize that some of our most pressing environmental problems don't always need technical or scientific solutions. They're not so much a question of what we're able to do, but what we're willing to do. Are we willing to take the steps necessary to stop global climate change? Do our values and ethics require us to do so? In this section, the book looks at some religious perspectives and how they may influence attitudes about nature. Part of the ethical concern and our moral concerns include environmental justice. People of color in the United States and around the world are subjected to a disproportionately high level of environmental health risks in their neighborhoods and on their jobs. Minorities who tend to be poor and more disadvantaged than other residents work in the dirtier jobs where they are exposed to toxic chemicals and other hazards. More often than not, they also live in urban areas or rural poverty pockets that have higher pollution levels and are also under pressure to house unpopular industrial facilities such as toxic waste dumps, landfills, smelters, refineries, and incinerators. Have you heard of NIMBY? It's an acronym for Not in My Backyard. Think about this for a minute. Would you think of something that you would not really want to have in your community, but where should it go? Have you heard of Lulu? This is a locally unwanted land use and is a planning term. It's when a particular use that is needed by society is objectionable to the actual neighborhood in which it might go. In California, we're required to consider environmental justice in our environmental law, or CEQA. That's the California Environmental Quality Act, which we will get to. On May 8th in 2012, the California Attorney General's Office released a report which interprets existing law to impose environmental justice obligations that local governments must consider when they're approving specific projects and planning for future development. The report then interprets the California Environmental Quality Act and its implementing guidelines to require agencies to consider the public health burdens of a project as they relate to environmental justice issues. So this is a picture depicting a typical problem with environmental justice. Another aspect of the environment is environmental racism. Racial prejudice is the belief that people are inferior merely because of their race. Racism is prejudice with power. Environmental racism is is inequitable distribution of environmental hazards based on race. There's evidence that the lead load of children of African American, Latino, Native American, and Asian descent who live in inner city areas is higher than others. This lead is absorbed from old lead-based house paint, contaminated drinking water from lead pipes or lead solder, and soil polluted by industrial effluents and an automobile exhaust. Native Americans have been pressured to take on certain unpopular facilities, like waste disposal, dumps, incinerators, and landfills. Another concept that is talked about is toxic colonialism. The practice of targeting poor communities of color in developing nations for waste disposal and/or experimentation with risky technologies is called toxic colonialism. Internationally, the trade in toxic waste has mushroomed in recent years as wealthy countries have become aware of the risks of industrial refuse. Although a treaty regulating international shipping of toxics is signed by 105 nations, millions of tons of toxic and hazardous materials continue to move, either legally or illegally, from richer countries to poorer ones every year. This issue will be discussed further in Chapter 23. One of the ways we export our pollution is in the form of discarded electrical equipment, such as computers and cell phones. Often these items are broken apart to remove the lead, copper, and other components. Conditions for workers can be extremely hazardous. California is still trying to get a hold of illegal exportation of e-waste. So in conclusion, we face many environmental dilemmas, but there are challenges, but also opportunities. The environmental science is the discipline that helps us understand and solve these problems. And ultimately, sustainable development, however we define that, is the goal. Environmental science is a discipline that can draw on many kinds of knowledge to understand the problems and help us find solutions. We can draw from technical, biological, economic, political, and social fields of study. I think the title of this book is appropriate. Environment is a global concern. We will study environmental issues in this very broad environmental, global, and social context.